Welcome everyone. We'll just let people come into the room and then we'll start in just a minute. Fantastic. Welcome everyone to the latest session in the Oxford Development Talks series, the series that's trying to take the best ideas in Oxford development and make them available to the wider public as broadly as possible. Today I'm delighted that we're joined by Professor Chris Adam. Chris is Professor of Development Economics in the Oxford Department of International Development, and his work focuses mainly on the macroeconomics of low-income countries, particularly focusing on Africa. His work focuses a lot on monetary policy and public finance questions. And in addition to his academic work, he's got a lot of experience of engaging with public policy debates, having been involved with working actively with the IMF and DFID over a number of years. And very relevantly to the current context, Chris is going to talk about his current and latest research on the topic of national lockdowns and global spillovers, some macroeconomic aspects of COVID-19 in Sub Saharan Africa, so that we can really dive into this question of what do we know so far about what lockdowns and COVID-19 are doing to the macroeconomic landscape in Africa. So Chris, over to you to give some introductory remarks and a bit of a talk, and then we'll move to Q&A. And if you think of questions while Chris is talking, please type them into the chat box and we'll come to as many of those questions as we can after Chris has spoken. All yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for organizing this event. I do have a few slides and I will share them in a moment. Let me just start by way of a little bit of background and motivation. What I'm going to talk about is based on a short little note that I'm doing with a couple of colleagues on this topic for an issue on COVID-19 that has been published virtually by the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. And this is an issue consisting of a set of short papers that touch on various aspects globally of COVID-19. So I guess the point that I want to focus on is that while Sub-Saharan Africa as a region is, at least at the moment, has experienced a lower caseload and lower fatalities than elsewhere in the world, it has probably been hit as hard, if not harder, than elsewhere from the economic consequences of the global pandemic. And I want to use my 20 minutes or so today just to sketch out some of the characteristics of that macroeconomic shock, the nature of the shock, and talk a little bit about policy options and the constraints around domestic macroeconomic policy choices. Why, in a sense, this well-known phrase of doing whatever it takes is a highly constrained choice set for many governments in Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to talk a little bit about what countries are in fact doing, what adjustments they are able to make, what adjustments they're not able to make, and then conclude with some observations on the role of international development partners, development assistance in particular. So that's roughly what I want to say, and I'll try and limit myself to about 20 minutes to do this. So in order to proceed, let me share my slides, and again, I would be, I just want to confirm that you're all seeing the full slide. This is a title slide. Alex, can you confirm that everybody can see this?
Yeah, it's visible, it's shared. Just click on slideshow and then we'll get the full screen.
Okay, so there's this. Okay, I think
Perfect.
that's, yeah, okay, very good. So let me start with a kind of a statement of the obvious. And this is very well known. What I've done here is just plotted two series overlaid on each other. The solid lines are for different regions of the world, the daily reported COVID-19 cases, and that's up until about a week or so ago. And the shaded bars comes from the index that the Blavatnik School here in Oxford has developed on the intensity of global lockdown. And I basically just want to take one point from this, which is come through very clearly, that many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa moved rapidly to implement lockdown measures early in the process, and then with great intensity from about the second week of March. Despite the fact that at that time and subsequently the case rate has not increased nearly as rapidly as in other parts of the world, although everything we say about the evolution of the public health dimension of the pandemic is highly conditional, and there's an awful lot of uncertainty around that. But the point is that countries in the region moved quickly and aggressively to lock down economic activity. This may have kept the growth of cases as low as it apparently is, although measurement is always very difficult in these circumstances. But the point is that the lockdown was put in place. Lockdowns are beginning to ease across Sub-Saharan Africa. And what I want to do today is to look at the consequence of that easing, but to make another critical point about the economic dimension of lockdown in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the economic dimension is very simple. It is that this macroeconomic shock that is confronting the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm going to come back to what I mean by this in a moment, but the shock is large and extremely complex. Complex in the sense that it consists of a number of elements. On the first hand, it's a simple lockdown shock. It's the closure or the removal of labor from the labor market, the closure of economic activities in key sectors. And here's some evidence from Uganda, which is taken from Google. These are the Google mobility measures that have been used quite widely. And what we have in the dark line here is the movement out of work, formal sector employment in particular, from about mid-March onwards, when the lockdown went into place in early April in Uganda. So there's been a very, very sharp reduction of labor in the formal economy, in particular in the urban economy. The yellow line is central and includes the major urban centers. Obviously, northern and eastern Uganda, the blue and green lines there's a somewhat less dramatic shutdown, but a shutdown nonetheless. So very significant lockdown. But that's only the first step in the process, not least a step that is unwinding and unwinding rather quickly, both in Uganda but elsewhere. We know in other parts of the continent, lockdown has been removed quite substantially. The second element, and this is the one that makes the macroeconomics so different in this part of the world, is the effect of the spillover from the global recession, which one way of thinking about it is a major squeeze on import capacity, the ability to consume the goods and services that previously had been consumed. And this comes through, I think, three main channels that are going to prove to be extremely important when we think about public policy. Obviously, commodity prices. If you're an oil exporter, the price of oil dropped more or less through the floor. It's stabilized, but stabilized at very, very low levels. Other commodity prices, perhaps with the exception of gold, have also fallen very sharply. Some key sectors, tourism, if you think about East African economies, tourism is basically ground to a complete halt. Other particular export sectors, horticulture, for example, has been very badly affected in Kenya and elsewhere in East Africa. Those are on the current account, the trade account. But if you look at the capital account, we've got three major interruptions to the flow of capital that basically finances a lot of expenditure. Debt capital has come to, debt flows have come to a sudden stop, at least from the private sector. Some have gone into reverse, and foreign direct investment has slowed down very, very substantially. But perhaps one of the biggest impacts for the region, and for many countries individually in the region, is a slowdown in remittances. So, and this is a slowdown that I think is immediately seen immediately in the data, but is likely to get worse, not least because many of those that are remitting income are currently, in the short run, being protected by kind of furlough arrangements and other sorts of income support in Europe or in the advanced economies. As those support mechanisms unwind, then the slowdown in remittances back to countries in Sub-Saharan Africa may well accelerate. And any of you who've read the World Bank reports on prospects for remittances will be aware that they take a very pessimistic view about the ability of remittance flows to be sustained. So what I want to do then is put those three things together. And let me just say what I'm doing in practice in characterizing this shock. I'm drawing here on some previous work that I have done, which actually was looking at the impact of natural disasters on small open economies and looking at how economies adjust when infrastructure or public capital is destroyed or rendered ineffective as a result of natural disasters, typically kind of floods or hurricanes and the like, and thinking about the public policy responses in those circumstances. And I'm using that basic macro framework to try and calibrate the extent of the macroeconomic slowdown or the macroeconomic shock in various sub-Saharan African countries. I'm just going to show you one example today, but it's I want to just make 2 points to start with. The first is, at some level, you may say, well, what's the point in doing this? It's pretty obvious. This is a pretty dreadful hit, and things are going to look very grim. And you're going to tell me at the end of this talk that if we have more foreign assistance, international financial assistance, then things won't be quite as bad. That in some sense is true. But I think doing this kind of exercise is quite a useful way of both calibrating the scale of the shocks, understanding the nature of these complex shocks, and therefore, in particular, understanding the channels through which these domestic supply shocks and global spillover effects impact the economy in general, the aggregate economy in general, and in particular, as a way of getting a first order insight on what the key distributional effects are, what sectors gain, what sectors lose, or perhaps more precisely, which sectors lose more. It helps to understand what the pressures are likely to look like in terms of the public-private dimension, the fiscal policy response, the relationship between the state and the private sector. And it's important as a way of understanding the intertemporal or the dynamic aspects of adjustment, how it affects the balance between current expenditure and consumption on the one hand and investment on the other. So using a model that we've calibrated for Uganda, we put together a picture of this is just one snapshot from a much more complicated model that looks at the components of the shock and how they play out over time. And what I've plotted here against a trend which is essentially a 3% per annum per capita growth rate, which is the most recent pre-COVID projections for Uganda. That's the dotted line. What this picture shows is the shortfall relative to that from the lockdown itself, which occurs essentially in the second quarter of the current year of 2020. We're just coming to the last month of that quarter, and projecting that forward for about 5 years. Now, this is not a forecast in a statistical sense. This is a simulation, a scenario planning of what might eventuate under the various elements of the lockdown that I spoke about. So the light green bars at the top refer to the direct effects of the lockdown itself, and the darker green bars are the other knock-on second round effects in the domestic economy, the effect of lower levels of economic activity, the higher costs of business, the closure of say sectors like hospitality, and the blue bars at the bottom represent the spillover effect from the international economy. That's the remittance, the slowdown, the terms of trade effects. And a couple of things are important here. The first is, obviously, this is an immediate shock and occurring here, but even on this projection, with nothing else happening and no second lockdown, sorry, the effect of this shock is persistent. We're looking at over 5 years here, but more importantly, the depth is profound. We're looking at, in the short run, before any possible mitigation could be put in place, we're looking at a shock of something in the region of 25 to 30% in real per capita consumption on average. This is an enormous effect, and one that I think can be seen from elsewhere around the world in other regions, but is larger than anything that any of the economies of Sub-Saharan Africa have had to deal with outside outright conflict. So it's a huge shock, but importantly, it's a shock that is not idiosyncratic in the sense that it's not a single country crisis, it's a continental crisis that this picture is going to play out, not just for Uganda, but more generally across the continent. So let me make a comment about policy responses, and then I want to talk about the international agencies in the final 5 minutes or so. We hear a lot about the term "whatever it takes," and this is a fundamentally different concept in low-income countries compared to the advanced economies, and for a variety of reasons. Most obviously, limited foreign exchange reserves, no complicated central bank swap lines that allow central banks to borrow billions of dollars through standing arrangements with the Fed and other central banks. There is limited fiscal space because of recent history. And this is a shock that's going to be persistent. So the key kind of mantra around the macroeconomics of this shock is finance if you can, adjust if you must. So if it's possible to finance, borrow, or otherwise receive external finance to work through this shock, that clearly must be the priority, but adjustment of some form is necessary. But before I talk about those adjustment mechanisms to motivate the discussion, let me just show you the contrast. I think this is really interesting to put some of this in context. This is from the IMF Fiscal Monitor from a few days ago. And the red bars here are spending and revenue measures that countries have taken. And these should be read against this scale on the left-hand side, which is the percent of GDP. These are very large numbers, 10, 15% of GDP on immediate spending and revenue measures designed to offset the adverse effects of the of economic lockdown. The blue bars are, you can think of that as expanding the balance sheets of the central banks. It's loans, equity, guarantees, financial support through the banking system that's typically coming from central banks rather than straight from government balance sheets or government accounts. And here on the right-hand side, we have this in dollar terms. For the G20 countries, the richer countries of the world, we have roughly $4.5 trillion of spending and tax cuts, and an almost equivalent amount of expanding the balance sheet of the central banks. So relying on central banks to provide loans, guarantees, financing facilities to firms, and so forth. This is astronomical. This is more than 10% of global GDP. It's an absolutely phenomenal amount of money. But bear that $9 trillion in mind as I come to my final number in a couple of minutes. Putting this in another context, this is a little picture of the balance sheets of the major central banks of the world. That's the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China. So it's the biggest central banks in the world, and this is their balance sheet. So this is going to increase as they increase their lending and support operations. I've highlighted the global financial crisis, which at the time we thought was an unprecedented increase in the balance sheets of the central banks. And a lot of this increase over the recent years is partly trend growth, but partly things like quantitative easing. And here is the increase. This is the 5 trillion increase in essentially a month. In the advanced economies, the capacity of central banks to support economies is really profound. If we look at our own country where we're sitting at the moment, in the Bank of England, 20 years ago, its balance sheet was 5% of GDP. Today, it's 35% of GDP. It's a massive increase, way bigger than during the global financial crisis and way bigger than during previous crises in the 20th century. Okay, my final couple of points. This is the same picture with three policy strategies overlaid. And the first one I want to focus on is this bottom line. It says, suppose a country like Uganda cannot access foreign assistance, and it has to engineer an adjustment through this process from its own resources. What that means is sort of cutting back on public investment, cutting back on health and education expenditure, increasing domestic taxes, which undercuts incentives for investment in the domestic economy. And what that does is it may trim the depth of the recession in the short run, but it massively prolongs the recovery process, a very slow recovery process as the domestic economy struggles with high levels of debt and high levels of taxation that are choking off private investment growth and welfare. What we do next is look at essentially asking the question, so how much increase in net ODA, overseas development assistance, would be required to bring the economy back to a slightly more rapid or even more rapid recovery process? And this is where I want to end my comments and open up for discussion. What is the gap between these two lines? Well, the gap between these two lines is filled by aid, net foreign inflows. This is hypothetical, of course. If we could access these resources, we could smooth that adjustment path quite dramatically. Not completely. The economy would still be suffering a very substantial hit, but not as bad as were it left to its own devices. So the question is, how much more resource is required, and is that likely to be forthcoming? This is a picture from the IMF. This is a daily updated picture from the IMF web page, which looks at the, as it says, countries receiving emergency financing and debt relief. And this is today's picture. So these are all the arrangements that have been put in place across the world from various forms of financing instruments from the IMF, rapid financing, upgrading existing arrangements, something called the Rapid Credit Facility, or the new one, the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, which was originally set up to look at natural disasters, but public health disasters would be included. So there is a response, and there's a response across part of Sub-Saharan Africa. But this money is not large. This money is not large. It's about less than $1 billion at the moment. What is required, and this is my final point for the moment. From our analytical work, we have done a series of calculations to work out how much additional funding would be required if we wanted to get to this navy blue line, the recovery supported by increased aid flows. And the number is essentially this. It's about $55 billion of additional external finance, roughly doubling the flow to Sub-Saharan Africa that is currently, well, slightly more than doubling, that at the moment flows into Sub-Saharan Africa of net overseas development assistance from the DAC donors, so that excludes China, would be in the order of $30 to $35 billion per annum. And in order to close that gap, we'd need to see an increase of about 45 to 50 billion over the next per annum over the next 2 years. So it's a pretty substantial increase, but not that substantial in the following sense, that it's no greater than the increase in net overseas development assistance that occurred during the period of debt relief in the early 2000s. And then finally, think about the number that I've mentioned. I said $50 billion additional. That is nothing compared to the $9 trillion that we're seeing in the G20 countries. That's $9 trillion being used to finance adjustment in the G20 countries themselves. So that raises a whole set of issues for the bank, the fund, the bilateral donor community. Can these resources be mobilized? For example, in a country like the UK, when the net ODA is anchored to our GDP numbers, then applying the formula, UK aid is going to decrease next year, not increase. And I think we've got to bring this debate forward onto the agenda to think about the capacity in the international system to provide the net ODA flows necessary, not even to eliminate, but at least to smooth what is otherwise an incredibly painful adjustment path ahead for not just Uganda, but for a number of sub-Saharan African countries. Let me leave it there because I'm hoping that this stimulates questions and discussion rather than me going through more and more slides trying to detail various little bits and pieces. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much. That was very, very clear. And what started out as a very bleak and pessimistic story had a tale of optimism. I mean, I take from that a sort of headline claim that actually, if we as a sort of global community were just prepared to invest roughly what we invested in debt relief in the early 2000s and an absolute fraction of what we're investing in our own economies at the moment, then we could smooth the curve of some of the worst potential economic effects in sub-Saharan Africa. So that gives us some grounds for optimism. We've got some questions coming in, but I just wanted to start by asking you a bit about the part of your graph that mentions with reform. So you've got the curve which is about supported by ODA, and then you've got the supported by ODA with reform. What are the reform elements that you envisage? What can be done by sub-Saharan African countries like Uganda to, if it were, help themselves alongside this emphasis on external support?
No, that's a very good point. What we were doing in this case was trying to engage with the debate about whether a kind of disruptive crisis is an opportunity to explore various forms of public finance reform. That there may be blockages or interest group coalitions that have resisted kind of welfare improving public finance reforms that maybe could be explored. Now, this is a very hypothetical chart. It's sort of saying, in a sense, this is what some of the gains on the table are, and it was a way in our paper to talk about some of the political economy issues associated with the fact that disruptive crises may be an opportunity to shift the political equilibrium in a way that can unlock previous distortions. One classic example would be many countries are dealing with the issue of fuel subsidies. So fuel subsidies are distortionary on the aggregate level. They may be undesirable for a whole set of environmental considerations, and they're typically rather regressive because fuel subsidies are, on the whole, captured by the middle classes. At a time when fuel prices are dropping through the floor, this may be the opportunity to remove fuel subsidies. If they're connected to the fuel price, then there may be opportunities to look at that. This is also anticipating what I suspect are going to be medium-term debates, not just in Sub-Saharan Africa, but around the world about the future of taxation. I suspect in this country, for example, we're going to see a major renewal of the debate about the taxation, the fact that this is a country that can't kind of live on North American taxation and European aspirations as far as welfare and spending is concerned. And I think there is around the corner an important and progressive opportunity to explore issues of taxation more generally. And what we're doing with this, I didn't want to talk about in detail, but we're just saying, look, these are economies that are operating at present under quite distorted tax and public finance systems. And if in a sense a crisis is an opportunity to restructure the political economy around public finance and taxation, then there are clearly gains on the table. That's really, subsidies, leakages, exemptions, that efficiency in public expenditure, that's the kind of things that we're looking at here.
Fantastic. We've got a few questions. Francis Stewart asks, in your model, what assumptions are you making about the recovery in the world economy?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a number of things going on, all of which are highly contested. As we say in the paper, this is not a forecast. The assumption, for example, on the terms of trade, commodity prices likely to remain low for long. The assumptions about kind of the recovery of things like the export service sector, so that could be tourism, horticulture, etc. We're seeing those beginning to unwind after about 24 months or so. A number of these projections we're taking from things like recent World Bank forecasts of commodity prices and trends. Likewise, the remittances, probably after a second year. But as Francis probably is well aware, her guess is as good as mine, is as good as the next person's. We're dealing with just profound uncertainty here. And it may be so uncertain that an exercise like this is dangerously misleading because it has a spurious kind of specificity about it, and I'm very conscious of that. But those are the main issues that we're assuming. The shock itself assumes that the baseline shock assumes that net ODA flows remain constant, and then we look at what happens if we increase them. You may ask why the net ODA line doesn't catch up with the shock a little bit further out. That's because not all of net ODA is grants. A fair amount of it is debt. So there is an additional debt burden built into that story.
Great. We've got a question from Andris Dubrovskis, who says, without a doubt, the current pandemic, accompanied by not only national but also global lockdown, is having a devastating effect on poor countries. But Andres wonders whether there might also be opportunities to take into account local adaptation and mitigation strategies in addition to global responses. So rather than just focusing on the national and its interaction with the global level, are there opportunities at the national and local levels to develop responses that might also change the trajectory?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. Part of what we're trying to do is to sort of how constrained at a macroeconomic level domestic responses are, because central banks in small open economies that don't have a reserve currency can't do whatever it takes to the same degree that advanced economies can. But within this rather pessimistic path of recovery with domestic measures only case, there's a lot of variation around possible options. Are there ways of configuring the balance between expenditure adjustment and tax adjustment in short run that makes this a more attractive path? To what extent do you want to protect or ring fence public investment as opposed to other forms of government spending becomes part of it. A lot of the kind of building back better sets of issues are going to play out over a slightly longer horizon, because they're about institutional reform, they're about the composition of investment, the introduction of various forms of thinking about kind of smart industrial policy, investing in resilience of various types. I may be too pessimistic about how constrained circumstances are. I'm very struck by the fact that if you look at the detailed data on what countries are doing, there is quite a lot of action in the short run. Central banks, ministries of finance are absolutely doing the right things, but they're doing them within a very constrained fiscal space. So I think there's scope for a very important debate about local options, and these are going to vary enormously depending on the detailed structure of different economies. It's different in an oil producing economy versus an oil importing economy, for example. It's going to be different in Nigeria compared to Ethiopia. But I suppose the point in this paper is that at a macroeconomic level, the fiscal space is really very constrained, and so there's not a lot of movement around these paths. It's the tyranny of budget constraints, that there is a limit to, if you're hitting the economy this hard with an enormous external negative shock, adjustment is going to be really painful however you configure it.
Tom Quirk asks, is there a risk that this shock may impact future trend GDP growth in some sub-Saharan African countries, as well as having the short-term and medium-term impacts modeled in your simulation? So are you sort of holding constant the assumption of the predicted original GDP growth patterns without taking into account the fact that the GDP growth patterns may also be affected?
Over this short horizon, we're comparing it to a counterfactual where the trend growth is what it is. But Tom's absolutely right on this, that what we try and do in the language of economics, that these are hysteresis effects, the idea that temporary shocks can have permanent effects on the kind of the structure and the underlying productivity growth of any economy. I think global trend growth is likely, well, let's not say global, certainly Western Hemisphere trend growth is likely to be lower for quite some time. I think there's a really interesting question about the exposure of different sectors in countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, how that plays out in terms of trend growth. If you believe, for example, that the high productivity sectors are those that are more exposed to global value chains, that are more exposed to the kind of global trade and services revolution of the last 20 or 30 years, and that those sectors are the ones that are likely to recover more slowly, then I think this concern about what's happening to long-run trend growth is a serious one. One of the things about this shock that is challenging, I think, is that some of the thinking I've been doing in other contexts about natural disasters is that the natural disaster has as a big part of it the destruction of physical capital, and that creates an incentive to build back better, to build back more resilient, more flexible, more productive capital. Here, it's, in a sense, the capital is untouched. There's not a kind of instant shortage of capital problem that stimulates an investment response, except perhaps in human capital. And we have so the prospects, the opportunities for building back better are also quite heavily constrained.
I suppose, Chris, I mean, one question that sort of strikes me as someone who's not a macroeconomist is, I look at the main graph that we're all seeing, and I wonder what this means in terms of human consequences. Yeah. So let's say we're in the worst case scenario of having a very long, significant, extended deviation from the previous trajectory, and then we see this massive downturn. What does this mean in terms of sort of microeconomic impacts, but also in terms of what it means for people's lives on the level of sort of human development indicators? Related to that, for instance, Gabriella Mallow asks in the chat box, what impact may COVID-related economic downturn have in human movement between countries in the region? And I know that sort of extrapolating from macroeconomic scenarios to a variety of microeconomic and human development indicators is a very broad question, but just for everybody listening who's not necessarily a macroeconomist, could you put in terms what's at stake here?
Well, to be crude about it and not too kind of journalistic, what's at stake is probably the last 20 years of human development progress in the continent. It's as I say, this is an absolutely profound shock. And it's a shock that's correlated across all countries. So that does make it very different. It means that, for example, over the last 5 or 10 years, one of the great changes in the structure of African economies is intra-African trade and the growth of trade. But that depends on demand. That has to be led in a sense by the end demand as a driver of that trade process. So the fact that this shock is so heavily correlated across countries, I think, puts a lot of that development in trade at risk. A big part of it is understanding what the feasible public sector response is, the extent to which how governments choose to balance their kind of commitments on social protection, education, health, versus kind of investment in physical infrastructure, the kind of roads, power, market connection investment. These margins become very acute, I think, when you're dealing with a big negative hit like this. I would defer to experts, including yourself, on implications for migration or mobility more generally around the region, whether at a political level this is going to stimulate much greater kind of nationalism and a kind of countries seeking to turn inwards and be less engaged on sort of improving the expansion of regional markets and greater mobility. But I think that's at risk. There is the generic effects on globalization in general, and quite a number of countries in the region have in recent years staked a lot on a development strategy or a growth strategy that is seeking to basically engage in increased globalization. Now, some of that may pay off big time. I think of Rwanda's heavy investment in e-services and kind of trade and services that are exploiting time zones, language, skilled workforce, providing digital services, and that's likely to be a growth sector. The question is, how much weight does that have in the overall recovery? The other thing that a lot of people are talking about is the extent to which this is going to change the globalization of the food industry. And I think that's a really interesting area. It's not an area that I know very much about, but the extent to which that's going to shift the balance in terms of the tradability of food.
Yeah, it's obviously very interesting thinking about how the macroeconomic work you're doing and those predictions then speak to other social scientific work about the effects of recessions and shocks in Sub-Saharan Africa on a whole variety of secondary effects, from conflict to quality of governance to human mobility. But I suppose what's fascinating and exciting about the work you're doing is it gives us a basis to think through some of those other secondary effects. Yume Tamia asked a question saying, thank you for your presentation. The COVID-19 crisis has led to substantially increased debt, and Sub-Saharan African countries would obviously need financial aid. The economist Jason Hickel argues that aid moves from the global south to the north. There is still the issue of multinationals extracting resources or moving financial resources from poor Sub-Saharan African countries through illicit financial flows, avoiding taxes, transfer pricing, etc. Do you think that enhancing international coordination amongst countries in terms of taxation will be needed to protect financial resources for Sub-Saharan African countries? So I suppose part of that question is about the risk of your point about capital flight being extended to some of the resources that are put in internationally. And that relates, I suppose, to Lawrence Evans' point, where he says, how would $50 billion be applied without it being squandered? Yeah. What would be needed to avoid sort of, to include pay down debt, poverty release, targeted economic assistance, yeah, to ensure that the money goes where it's needed and doesn't just disappear and come out of those countries?
Yeah. No, these are all very relevant questions. In a sense, the reform of global taxation is something that, COVID or not, has and should be a priority, has been an increasing priority and should continue to be a priority. But I think this is, again, if you look at sort of episodes in history where major disruptive crises stimulate societies to rethink around taxation, you think of the 1930s as a classic example. You may take some optimism from that. On the other hand, we're not living in an era of enormously progressive global politics. So whether there's an opportunity to improve and really push forward on that agenda around taxation, transparency, multinational corporations, etc. I don't know. I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure how optimistic we should be on that. It's always the case that talking about large resource transfers, aid, international finance assistance, brings up the issue of the efficiency of these transfers and so forth. But I would go back to the HIPC debt relief initiative period, and you can look at that, and nobody's saying that this was a perfectly seamless and uncomplicated step up in resource flows, but it was an episode where a large number of countries received a large volume in terms of debt relief. The cash flow consequences were pretty significant, and the period from the beginning of the early HIPC episodes through to relatively recently have been a period of very substantial improvement in macroeconomic performance, in governance, in public financial management. Things are not perfect, but I think there has been a fairly high degree of progress and success in the management of that resource transfer, that I would be less pessimistic about the fear that no, let me put it another way. I would be very worried if this concern about the effectiveness at the margin of these resource transfers was advanced as an argument for not making progress on this issue. I think international cooperation, coordination, and the resource transfer issue have got to be advanced together. Nobody's going to tell me that the 9 trillion that the G20 are mobilizing is going to be everywhere and always well targeted and not subject to redistribution, reallocation, and abuse. So I think it's a serious concern, but I don't think it should be a concern that is advanced as a reason for not moving with enhanced external assistance.
Fantastic. We're almost out of time, but there are 2 sort of remaining questions. So I'll put both of those questions to you together, Chris, and then invite you to sort of say any final words you want to offer. I mean, Lawrence Evans also asks, where is China in this? Can Chinese investment be part of the solution?
Yep.
And Kenichi Doi, building on some of what you just said, asked how we should balance the sort of traditional approach to overseas development aid, which is focused often on infrastructure or project-based interventions versus direct budget support. Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting we should go back to sort of direct budgetary support? What's the sort of balance that's likely to be appropriate to address the kind of considerations you've looked at? So either of those that you want to briefly answer, go for it, and any final words are very welcome.
Okay, let me take them in reverse order. I think this is a case for direct budget support. I think, and what's interesting is the institution that's often at the center of of the firestorm, the IMF have moved pretty quickly, and pretty much IMF support is entirely, it takes the form of direct budget support. It's basically supporting the balance sheets of the government and the public sector. It's conditional in a macroeconomic sense, but it is the equivalent of budget support. I think that's exactly the way you want to do this. This is emergency, quick dispersing, unconditional in a sense, resource transfers that are required. Clearly, there's a role for China. I've used the term ODA, which is sort of strictly a DAC term, but what I mean is external resource flows. But those two last questions linked together. This is a classic case where this is stabilization financing that we're looking at. This is different in a sense from long-term structural financing or direct kind of project financing around say infrastructure. As I say, this is not a crisis where infrastructure has been destroyed. This is a crisis when demand has been destroyed, and it's the use of external financing to support aggregate demand rather than to reconstruct aggregate supply that is the priority here. So I would say, to the extent that resource flows from China can be kind of constructed in a budget support manner, is what over this horizon is the priority. Let me just make one final observation. I'm very aware of the crudeness of macroeconomics. It's in some sense, it's high-level accounting more than anything else. It's trying to keep the broad orders of magnitude in place. There is quite a bit of work behind this, but this is really just a small contribution to a much more nuanced discussion, both across countries and within countries, and hopefully it helps to provide a bit of framing around which other more detailed, specific, nuanced debates can take place.
Thank you very much, Chris. This has been not only really informative, but I think also very accessible, even to those of us like me who are not macroeconomists. You've made it clear and relevant and very easy to follow and make sense of, and really shown, I think, what's at stake, what's at issue if we decide not to support Sub-Saharan African countries through overseas development assistance. But equally, I think you've offered some hope to say, well, yes, the enduring impacts of lockdown and recession on current trend could be very serious, but there are things that can be done through a combination of ODA and reform. So thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing so generously your ideas and engaging with the many great questions that were asked by the audience. There was one other question that Gabriella Mallow asked, and she said, is there going to be anything in the series looking at some of these questions in relation to Latin America? And I just finished by saying yes, and it's going to happen in Oxford Development Talks on Monday at 2 p.m. When our head of department, Diego Sanchez-Ancochea, will focus on the impact of the pandemic on some political economy questions and issues of inequality in Latin America. So join us on Monday at 2 o'clock for another Oxford Development Talks. And for now, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks. Can I just check, Alex? Do you these are recorded, are they? You're mute. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, and it's still being recorded now. So shall I give you a call on Teams now, and then I can check in with you on that?
Sure. Okay, I'll hang up now. Thanks.